Throwable class is the root of everything. There are two child classes for throwable. One is exception and the another one is error. In error, there are a lot of errors: virtual machine error, assertion error, out of memory error. Like that, there are many errors. Errors a programmer cannot handle, whereas exception a programmer need to handle. So there are two type of exception. One is checked exception and another one is unchecked exception. In this video, we are going to learn about exception. Let's go to IntelliJ and we can create a class, new Java class, and I'm going to give the name of the class as exception demo. Now I'm going to create a main method. I'm going to print some statement. Okay, it's out for printing the statement, and I'm going to write statement 1. Now I'm going to duplicate this line up to 5 times, and I'm going to write 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, if I run the program, we are going to get the output. There will not be any kind of problem. See, we are getting the output from statement 1 to 5. Suppose think that in statement 3, divide number 4 by 0. We know that when we divide a number by 0, we will be getting infinity, right? So I'm going to run the program now. So when I run the program, we can see that we are getting only statement 1 and 2. After that, we are getting exception. So whatever things below that statement is not getting executed. That means the program flow is getting interrupted at line number 6. See? So here exception is occurring. We need to handle this exception. Line number 6 is a risky code. So we need to handle this risky code. For that, the first method is by using try catch block. So first of all, write the try keyword, then put curly braces. So inside the block, we need to give the risky code. Only write the risky code inside the try block. Don't write all the lines remaining that. Only the line which you feel risky, you should write inside the try block. Now, if try block is there, of course, catch block should be there. Put bracket, put curly braces. Inside the curly braces, as of now, I am writing exception occurred in order to understand. Okay. So this is an arithmetic operation 4 by 0. So we will be getting arithmetic exception. We need to write that inside this bracket. Arithmetic exception. And I am going to write exception, the reference. So this is the way for writing try catch block. And now when we run the program, we can see that we are not getting any exception. We are getting the entire output. Statement 1, statement 2, and statement 3 is a risky code. So the program is not getting interrupted. We are getting the entire output. See, statement 4, statement 5, everything we are getting. And we are getting an information like exception occurred. So we can debug and check where the exception occurred, and we can fix the issue. Now, as I said, there are two type of exception: checked exception and unchecked exception. We can learn about that. When I write 4 by 0, see, I'm not getting any error. Okay, but of course I know that this will give you an exception. Now I'm going to use the file reader class, and I'm going to write data file equal to new file reader. Inside that I'm going to write the file name as abc.text. I know in my system there is no file called abc.text, and see, the compiler is showing me an error. What is the error? Add exception to method signature. So the compiler is checking. Okay, so this is an checked exception. That means the compiler, when we write the program, the compiler will suggest you the exceptions. So those are checked exception. Whereas the above one, line number 6, the compiler is not telling you anything, but we know that we will get exception. So those are unchecked exception. This is a checked exception. Compiler is checking. So this is checked exception, and the above one is unchecked exception. I'm going to comment this line and line number 6. So this unchecked exception, we are not getting any issue when we write the program. The issue is going to come only at the runtime. So these exceptions are also known as runtime exception. So when we run the program, we are getting this exception, right? So all runtime exceptions are unchecked exception. Now I'm going to give you examples of runtime exception. Runtime exception are unchecked exception. That means the compiler is not checking. We are getting the exception only when we run the program. Those are runtime exception. So the first one, this is an arithmetic operation and we are getting arithmetic exception. So if you go inside the class, so going inside class, press Control B. See, arithmetic exception, the class extend runtime exception. So this is a subclass of runtime exception class. So arithmetic exception is an example. Then when we deal with arrays, we will get index out of bound exception. So if you go inside that class is also extending runtime exception. Then there is null pointer exception. Null pointer exception. So if you go inside that class is also extending runtime exception. Then there is illegal argument exception. So if you go inside that class, we can see it is also extending runtime exception. So all these exceptions which are extending runtime exceptions are unchecked exception. If you go to the API documentation of Java, we can see that these are the subclasses of runtime exception. So all these exceptions are unchecked exception. These exceptions we are getting only when we run the program. Some examples are arithmetic exception, then datetime exception, index out of bound exception. See, all these exceptions are unchecked exception. In order to get the examples of checked exceptions are the exception that are checked by compiler. See, as soon as I write the line, the compiler is suggesting me add exception to signature. So those are checked exception. The compiler is checking. Some examples are file not found exception. And if you go inside that class is extending IO exception. It is not extending runtime exception. So file not found exception is an example of checked exception. Then there is class not found exception. See, if you're going inside the class not found exception, this is also not extending runtime exception. That is also an example of checked exception. Then there is SQL exception. If you're going inside SQL exception class, see that is also not extending runtime exception. So this is also an example of checked exception. Then all the IO exceptions, we are dealing with files. So if you go inside the class, it is extending exception, not runtime exception. So this is also a checked exception. So these are the examples of checked exception and these are the examples of unchecked exception.